At the resort check-in, my daughter-in-law leaned toward the young clerk and whispered, "She's just the old woman. Put her in the smaller room near the elevator." She thought I couldn't hear her. My son stood beside her in pressed linen shorts and mirrored sunglasses, staring down at his phone as if nothing unusual had been said. As if his wife hadn't just reduced his 69-year-old mother to an inconvenience, standing 3 feet away. I smiled politely and said nothing. But later that night, one quiet phone call would turn our luxury family vacation into the beginning of the end for everything they thought they controlled. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know how far a broken heart can travel before someone finally understands it. The resort lobby smelled like white orchids and ocean air. Everything about the place was designed to make people feel important. Tall marble columns stretched toward a ceiling painted the color of seashells, and soft piano music drifted through the air while wealthy families rolled expensive luggage across polished floors. I had imagined this trip differently for months. When my son Daniel first invited me, he made it sound like a dream. "Mom, you deserve a vacation," he'd said over the phone one rainy Tuesday afternoon back in Ohio. It's been years since we all spent time together. Ava found this beautiful beachfront resort in Naples. The kids are excited you're coming. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the cordless phone against my shoulder while chicken soup simmered on the stove. For a moment, I'd actually believed him. After Harold died 3 years earlier, the house had become painfully quiet. Too quiet sometimes. The kind of quiet where you could hear the refrigerator humming at 2 in the morning. I missed being needed. I missed hearing footsteps upstairs. I missed having someone ask me how my day was. So when Daniel invited me on the family vacation, I clung to the idea harder than I probably should have. For weeks, I prepared like a schoolgirl getting ready for her first trip. I bought 2 new sundresses, even though I told myself they were too expensive. I had my silver hair freshly colored at the salon downtown. I even started walking every morning around the neighborhood lake so I wouldn't get tired keeping up with the children. My granddaughter Sophie was 12 now. My grandson Mason had just turned 8. Children grew so quickly these days. Half the time I felt like I was trying to catch up with memories before they disappeared. I wanted this trip to matter. I wanted them to remember me. The clerk at the counter gave me a nervous smile after Ava whispered to her. The poor girl couldn't have been older than 22. She glanced at me briefly, then back at her computer screen. "I apologize, ma'am," she said carefully. "There seems to have been a slight adjustment to the room arrangements." Daniel finally looked up from his phone. "What adjustment?" he asked distractedly. Ava answered before the clerk could. "Oh, nothing major," she said smoothly. "I just thought your mom would be more comfortable in a quieter room." Quieter. That was an interesting word considering she'd just asked to move me beside the elevators. I watched the clerk slide 2 gold room cards toward Daniel and Ava. "Your oceanfront suite is on the 12th floor," she said. Then she handed me a single card separately. "And your room is on the 3rd floor. 3rd floor. Not beside the family. Not near the children. Not even in the same tower." Something cold settled quietly into my chest. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he shrugged lightly. "It's probably easier this way, Mom," he said. "You like your privacy." Privacy. Funny how loneliness always sounds more respectable when someone else gives it a nicer name. Ava smiled brightly and rested her manicured hand on his arm. "Exactly," she said. "And this way everybody gets space to relax." Everybody. Not family. Not us. Everybody. I nodded slowly and picked up my suitcase handle. "Well," I said softly, "I'm sure it's lovely. Because women my age learn something important after enough disappointments. Dignity often survives by staying quiet." The bellman offered to carry my luggage, but I declined. I'd spent 40 years lifting. Grocery bags, moving furniture, carrying sleeping children from the car into the house after long drives home from Thanksgiving dinners. One small suitcase wasn't going to defeat me. Still, my shoulder ached by the time I reached my room. The hallway smelled faintly of chlorine and coconut sunscreen. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while ice clinked inside cocktail glasses. My room overlooked the parking garage. Not the beach. Not the gardens. The parking garage. I stood silently at the window for a long moment, staring at rows of luxury SUVs baking beneath the Florida sun. Then I laughed quietly to myself. Not because anything was funny. Sometimes disappointment becomes so familiar that your body stops recognizing it as pain. The room itself was technically beautiful. Large king bed, cream-colored curtains, marble bathroom, a bowl of complimentary fruit sitting beside a bottle of sparkling water. But it felt separate, like an afterthought. I unpacked carefully anyway. That's another thing women my age learn. You keep making the bed, even when nobody notices. You still fold your clothes properly. You still carry yourself with grace. Not because others deserve it. Because you do. Around sunset, Daniel texted the family group chat. Dinner at 7 downstairs by the beach patio. No heart emoji. No can't wait. Just information. I changed into my navy blue dress before dinner. The nice one with pearl buttons. Harold used to love that dress. You look elegant in blue, he always said. I could still hear his voice sometimes if the room was quiet enough. By 7:15, I was seated alone at the restaurant table watching strangers laugh beside tiki torches while the sun melted orange across the Gulf of Mexico. A waiter poured water into my glass twice. Will the rest of your party be joining you? He asked politely. Yes, I answered. At least I thought they would. At 7:32, Ava finally appeared wearing a flowing white resort dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Daniel followed behind her carrying Mason on his shoulders while Sophie stared down at her phone. Oh good, you already got seated, Ava said cheerfully. Not sorry, just relieved she hadn't needed to deal with it. The children barely looked up when they sat down. Hi Grandma, Sophie murmured automatically. Mason smiled briefly before returning to the tablet in his hands. I studied my son across the table. At 44, Daniel looked so much like his father it sometimes startled me. Same broad shoulders, same tired eyes. But Harold would never have allowed this kind of distance inside a family. Never. The waiter handed out menus. Ava barely glanced at hers. We already ate a little by the pool, she explained. The kids were starving. I folded my napkin slowly across my lap. Of course they had. The dinner reservation had only included me. As the conversation drifted around me, I realized something painful. Nobody asked me a single question. Not how my flight was. Not whether I liked the resort. Not whether I'd been lonely lately back home. I simply existed at the edge of their vacation like background decoration. Ava dominated every conversation effortlessly. The spa appointment tomorrow. The yacht excursion Friday. The private beach cabana Daniel had rented. Every plan had already been made. Every decision already finalized. Without me. At one point, Mason accidentally knocked over his lemonade. The glass shattered across the patio tiles. Ava sighed dramatically. Oh my God, she muttered under her breath. I can't deal with 2 children at once. Her eyes flicked toward me when she said it. Subtle, cruel, intentional. Daniel pretended not to notice. Again, that hurt more than I expected. Not the insult itself. The silence afterward. You spend your whole life believing love will eventually make people brave enough to defend you. Sometimes it doesn't. The ocean breeze grew colder after dark. Or maybe that was just me. When dinner finally ended, Ava stood first. We're heading upstairs, she announced. Big beach day tomorrow. I smiled gently. Sounds wonderful. Daniel hesitated briefly beside the table. You okay getting back to your room, Mom? Not, come right up with us. Not, do you want company? Just, you okay? As if I were fragile. As if old age automatically meant helplessness instead of heartbreak. I'll manage, I said. He nodded once. Then they disappeared together into the glowing resort elevators while I stood alone beneath string lights, listening to waves crash somewhere beyond the darkness. I stayed outside another 20 minutes after they left. Not because I enjoyed the view. Because I wasn't ready to return to that lonely room overlooking concrete. An older couple sat nearby sharing a slice of cheesecake and laughing softly together. The man reached across the table to wipe whipped cream from his wife's lip. Such a small gesture. Such an ordinary kind of love. I looked away before envy could settle too deeply inside me. Back upstairs, I changed into my nightgown and carefully removed my jewelry beside the bathroom mirror. My face looked older under the harsh lighting. Tired. I touched the small gold wedding ring still resting on my finger. Some widows take theirs off immediately. I never could. Around 11, my phone buzzed. For one foolish second, I thought maybe Daniel was checking on me. Instead, it was a notification from Ava's social media page. A new family photo. The caption read, "Perfect vacation with the people who matter most, red heart." I stared at the picture. Daniel smiling. The children laughing. Ava glowing at the center. No sign of me anywhere. Not even a mention. I sat very still on the edge of the hotel bed while something shifted quietly inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Clearer. Because suddenly, the whisper at the check-in desk made sense. She's just the old woman. Not mother. Not grandmother. Not family. Just the old woman. And for the first time since arriving in Florida, I stopped asking myself how to earn my place back inside this family. Instead, I began wondering why I was fighting so hard to stay somewhere I was no longer wanted. I barely slept that first night at the resort. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ava's voice again. She's just the old woman. Funny how certain sentences keep echoing long after the room goes quiet. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and walked onto the tiny balcony outside my room. The Florida air felt warm and heavy against my skin, carrying the distant sound of waves. From somewhere beyond the parking structure, from the 12th floor tower across the property, I could see lights glowing from the oceanfront suites. They're suites. I wondered if the children were asleep already. I wondered if Daniel and Ava were sitting on their balcony, drinking wine together while the ocean shimmered below them. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe the room mix-up really had been innocent. Maybe Ava was stressed from traveling with children. Maybe Daniel simply didn't notice how hurtful things sounded. Women my age become experts at explaining away disappointment. We spend decades smoothing over tension so everyone else can stay comfortable. But deep down, something felt wrong. Not new, just finally impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke early out of habit. Harold had always been an early riser, and after 42 years of marriage, my body still followed the rhythm we built together. By 6:30, I was dressed and walking slowly through the resort gardens with a cup of coffee warming my hands. Palm trees swayed gently overhead while sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed grass. Somewhere nearby, tropical birds chirped loudly enough to sound almost fake. The resort looked beautiful in the morning light. Peaceful. Fresh. Like the kind of place families came to reconnect. I sat alone near a koi pond watching the water ripple softly around orange and white fish. Back home in Ohio, mornings usually meant silence and routine. Feed the birds. Read the newspaper. Water the flowers Harold planted before he passed away. Then another long day of trying not to notice how empty the house felt. I thought this vacation might interrupt that loneliness. Instead, it seemed to magnify it. Around 7:30, my phone buzzed. A group message from Ava. Breakfast at the Ocean Cafe at 8. Don't be late because we already booked the boat tour. No good morning. No smiley face. Just instructions. I arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early. Daniel and the children were already eating. Ava sat closest to the ocean view, wearing oversized sunglasses and a white sun hat that made her look like someone from a luxury travel magazine. Nobody noticed me approach at first. Sophie was taking pictures of pancakes for social media. Mason was complaining about sunscreen. Daniel was reading emails on his phone. And Ava was studying herself in the reflection of her coffee spoon. I stood there awkwardly for several seconds before Daniel finally glanced up. Oh, morning, Mom. That was it. Not come sit. Not, we ordered you coffee. Just acknowledgement. Like I was a neighbor who happened to run into them by coincidence. I slid quietly into the empty chair at the far end of the table. A waiter appeared beside me. Would you like the breakfast buffet, ma'am? Before I could answer, Ava smiled politely at him. She eats very lightly, she said. Just toast is probably enough. The waiter looked uncomfortable. So just toast, he asked carefully. I looked directly at Ava. I think I can order for myself. Her smile tightened for half a second. Then she laughed softly. Oh goodness, of course. I was only trying to help. Help. That word again. Everything cruel sounded kinder when wrapped in soft voices and pretty smiles. I ordered eggs, fruit, and coffee. Nothing extravagant. Still, I noticed Ava watching the prices beside each menu item. Daniel never looked up once. After breakfast, we walked toward the marina for the boat excursion Ava had booked. Or rather, they walked. I followed several steps behind. Families passed us laughing together beneath the bright morning sun. Little children ran ahead carrying beach buckets while couples held hands near the water. Meanwhile, my own son barely spoke to me. At one point, I overheard Sophie whispering to her mother. Why does Grandma always look sad? Ava adjusted her sunglasses calmly. She misses Grandpa, she answered. Older people get lonely when they don't have enough going on. Not cruel enough to sound cruel. That was Ava's specialty. She rarely insulted directly. Instead, she reduced people quietly, carefully, until they started questioning their own worth. The yacht itself was enormous. White leather seats, polished chrome railings, a smiling captain offering bottled water and champagne before departure. Ava immediately began taking photos. Daniel, stand by the railing. Sophie, chin up. Mason, stop squinting. Then finally, after photographing everyone else, she glanced toward me. Linda, can you take one of us? Linda, not Mom, not even Mrs. Carter. Just Linda. I took the phone from her hand anyway. The family gathered together beneath the sunlight while the ocean sparkled behind them. Daniel wrapped his arm around Ava's waist. The children smiled naturally beside their parents. They looked perfect, like one of those Christmas cards families send right before divorces nobody saw coming. Another one. Ava called. I snapped 3 more pictures. Not one included me. Later, while the boat drifted near the coastline, I sat quietly near the back rail watching dolphins rise briefly from the water. For the first time that day, I felt calm. The ocean had a way of reminding people how small their problems really were. Then I heard Ava laughing nearby. She still keeps all Harold's old clothes, she told another woman on the tour. I swear she acts like he's coming back. The women chuckled awkwardly. My fingers tightened around the railing. Harold's clothes. The flannel jackets hanging in our closet. The winter coat by the garage door. His reading glasses still resting beside the bed. People who haven't buried a husband don't understand those things. They think grief has an expiration date, as if love should disappear simply because time passes. I stared out across the endless blue water and swallowed the ache rising slowly into my throat. Then I heard Daniel's voice behind me. Mom. I turned slightly. For one hopeful second, I thought maybe he'd finally noticed. Maybe he'd finally seen what was happening. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Ava thinks maybe tonight you'd be more comfortable skipping dinner, he said carefully. The kids are getting tired, and we're probably just doing something quick. Something inside me went very still. Not broken. Still. Because suddenly I understood something painful. This vacation wasn't about bringing me closer to the family. It was about making me invisible slowly enough that nobody would feel guilty for watching it happen. That evening, I ate dinner alone in my room. Not because I wanted to. Because after Daniel's awkward little speech on the yacht, I suddenly understood something humiliating. They weren't trying to include me and failing. They were trying to exclude me politely. There's a difference. A painful one. I ordered a small bowl of seafood pasta from room service and sat beside the window overlooking the parking garage while the Florida sky turned dark purple beyond the palm trees. Somewhere across the property, music drifted upward from the beach restaurant. Laughter followed it. Glasses clinking. Children shouting excitedly near the pools. The sounds of people enjoying family vacations. I wondered what Daniel was doing at that exact moment. Probably sitting beside Ava at some candlelit table overlooking the ocean. Probably smiling for photos. Probably pretending everything was normal. I pushed the pasta around my plate more than I actually ate it. Grief changes your appetite in strange ways. So does loneliness. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. Another social media notification from Ava. This time it was a video. The caption read, "Perfect sunset dinner with my favorite people, red heart." I stared at the screen. Daniel sat beside her smiling while Sophie fed Mason bites of chocolate cake across the table. The ocean glowed gold behind them. Everyone looked happy, relaxed, whole. There was no empty chair in the video. No sign anyone was missing. That hurt more than I expected. Not because they forgot me. Because they remembered not to include me. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand and switched off the lamp beside the bed. But sleep still wouldn't come. Around midnight, I finally gave up and decided to walk downstairs for fresh air. The resort looked different at night. Quieter. More honest somehow. Without the bright sunlight and cheerful vacation music, you could see the exhaustion underneath people. Couples arguing softly near elevators. Parents dragging overtired children through marble hallways. Bartenders wiping down counters with blank expressions. Luxury always looks lonelier after midnight. I wandered slowly toward the main lobby, carrying my room key in one hand. That's when I heard Ava's voice. She was sitting in the lounge area near the cocktail bar with 2 women I recognized from the yacht earlier that day. They hadn't noticed me yet. I swear, if Daniel had his way, she'd move in with us permanently, Ava was saying with a tired laugh. The women chuckled sympathetically. She's lonely since her husband died. One of them offered gently. I understand that, Ava replied quickly. But there's lonely, and then there's emotionally dependent. Emotionally dependent. I stopped walking. My body went cold. She calls Daniel constantly. Ava continued, sipping her drink. And she still acts like he's her little boy instead of my husband. The other women exchanged awkward glances. One of them shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I should have walked away then. A dignified woman would have. But heartbreak has a way of rooting your feet to the floor. And honestly, Ava said quietly, lowering her voice, this trip was supposed to help Daniel realize how exhausting it is having her around all the time. A small silence followed. Then one woman asked carefully, does she know you feel this way? Ava laughed softly. Of course not. She'd cry. The women laughed again. Not cruelly, nervously, but they laughed. I stood there for another few seconds feeling something inside me slowly collapse. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like an old house finally giving way after years of hidden damage. Then Daniel appeared from the hallway carrying 2 coffees. He handed one to Ava and sat beside her casually. No hesitation, no confusion, as if this conversation wasn't surprising at all. She's still awake? Ava asked him. Daniel shrugged. She's probably in bed by now. The group laughed lightly again. I turned before they could see me. My legs suddenly felt unsteady beneath me as I walked back toward the elevators. Inside the mirrored walls of the elevator car, I caught my reflection under the soft lighting. Silver hair, tired eyes, thin shoulders wrapped in a pale blue cardigan. For the first time in my life, I saw myself exactly the way Ava saw me. Not as Daniel's mother, not as Harold's wife, not as the woman who spent decades building birthday parties, school lunches, Christmas mornings, and family traditions with her own 2 hands. Just an aging inconvenience people politely tolerated. By the time I reached my room, my chest hurt. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of ache that spreads slowly until breathing itself feels exhausting. I sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. Outside the window, headlights moved through the parking garage below like tiny drifting stars. And suddenly, memories began surfacing one after another. Little moments I had ignored for years. The Thanksgiving Ava insisted they spend with her family instead. The Christmas morning Daniel only called after dinner. The birthdays where my gifts sat unopened while the children played with expensive electronics Ava bought them. The way Daniel slowly stopped asking for my advice after he got married. The way Ava always answered his phone lately. The way every family decision somehow happened without me knowing. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Children grow up. Families change. Life moves on. But sitting there alone in that dark hotel room, I finally allowed myself to consider something I'd been avoiding for years. Maybe Ava hadn't slowly pushed me away from my son. Maybe Daniel had simply allowed it to happen because it was easier. That realization hurt more than anything she'd said. Because cruel strangers don't break your heart. Your own children do. The next morning, I woke with swollen eyes and a pounding headache from barely sleeping. For several minutes, I simply lay there staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. I didn't want to go downstairs. I didn't want to smile politely through another day pretending not to notice the humiliation. But at 9 o'clock, Daniel texted me. Meeting in the lobby at 10. We're touring beachfront properties today. Properties. I frowned at the message. Daniel had mentioned something briefly before the trip about investment opportunities, but I hadn't paid much attention at the time. Harold handled most financial conversations during our marriage. After he died, I learned enough to manage comfortably, but real estate investments still bored me. Still, something about the message felt strange. Especially the next sentence. Ava already scheduled meetings with 2 agents. Scheduled. Before even arriving. I sat up slowly in bed. A cold feeling crept quietly through my stomach. Then I remembered something else. 6 months earlier, Daniel had casually asked whether I'd ever considered downsizing the family house back in Ohio. At the time, I thought he was worried about me living alone. Now I wasn't so sure. And for the first time since arriving at the resort, I began wondering whether this vacation had a purpose none of them had bothered telling me about. I spent almost an hour getting ready that morning. Not because anyone would notice, but because somewhere deep inside me, a stubborn part still believed dignity mattered. I chose a light beige blouse Harold once bought me during a trip to Charleston years ago. He said the color made my eyes look younger. I smiled sadly remembering that. When you lose someone who truly loved you, ordinary objects become little museums of memory. A shirt, a coffee mug, a handwritten grocery list tucked inside a kitchen drawer. You begin measuring love by the things nobody else notices. By 10 o'clock, I stepped into the resort lobby and immediately spotted Ava near the entrance. She looked perfectly polished as always. Cream-colored pants, gold jewelry, sunglasses resting on top of carefully curled hair. Beside her stood Daniel scrolling through emails again while the children complained about being bored. Nobody greeted me when I approached. Ava simply glanced at her watch. "There you are," she said. "The realtor's already waiting." The realtor. Not realtors. 1. Interesting. Outside the resort, a black luxury SUV idled near the curb. A tall man in his 50s stepped forward, smiling broadly as we approached. "Daniel," he said warmly, shaking my son's hand. "Great to finally meet in person." Then his eyes shifted toward me. "And this must be Mrs. Carter." His smile changed slightly. Respectful. Professional. Unlike everyone else lately. I extended my hand politely. "Linda Carter," I corrected gently. He nodded immediately. "Of course. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carter." Ava's expression tightened for only a second before smoothing itself out again. Small moments reveal people if you pay attention carefully enough. We climbed into the SUV and drove south along the coastline, while the realtor pointed out private beaches, country clubs, and waterfront communities through the tinted windows. The children barely looked up from their tablets. Daniel asked questions about property taxes and rental income. Ava asked about gated security and resale value. Nobody asked what I thought. After 20 minutes, we arrived at a stunning beachfront property overlooking the Gulf. The house looked like something from a magazine. White stone exterior, floor-to-ceiling windows, a pool so blue it almost hurt to look at beneath the morning sun. The realtor smiled proudly. For bedrooms, private beach access, recently renovated. Ava walked inside immediately as if she already owned it. Daniel followed close behind her. I moved slower. The ocean breeze felt warm against my face while waves rolled softly across the sand behind the house. For a brief moment, standing there beside the water, I forgot the tension entirely. Harold loved the ocean. Every anniversary, he used to promise we'd retire somewhere near the coast someday. "We'll drink coffee watching the sunrise," he always said. But life moved quickly. Daniel's college tuition, medical bills, mortgage payments. Then suddenly we were old. And suddenly Harold was gone. Funny how fast forever disappears. Inside the house, Ava was already discussing furniture placement with the realtor. "This room would make a perfect office for Daniel," she said confidently. "And the upstairs guest room could maybe work for visitors." Visitors. Not family. Visitors. I quietly wandered toward the kitchen while they talked. Everything gleamed. Marble counters. Custom cabinets. Expensive appliances that probably required instruction manuals just to make coffee. Then I noticed something sitting on the island countertop. A folder. My name written across the front in black ink. Linda Carter. My stomach tightened instantly. The folder sat partially hidden beneath a stack of real estate brochures, as if someone forgot to move it before we arrived. I glanced toward the living room. Nobody was paying attention to me. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were printed financial documents, property estimates, tax records, and one page highlighted in yellow. Potential proceeds from Ohio home sale. I froze. My Ohio home. The family house Harold and I bought 36 years earlier. The same house where Daniel took his first steps. The same kitchen where I spent decades making birthday cakes and Thanksgiving dinners. The same front porch where Harold kissed me goodbye every morning before work. My hands began trembling slightly as I kept reading. Estimated market value. Suggested timeline for listing. Senior living recommendations near Naples. Senior living. For several seconds, the room around me seemed to blur. Not from age. From shock. A soft laugh echoed from the living room nearby. "Ava, she'll never maintain that big house forever anyway," she was saying casually. "This is probably the smartest time to transition." Transition. Such a clean little word. People use words like that when they want ugly things to sound compassionate. I carefully slid the papers back into place just as footsteps approached behind me. The realtor entered the kitchen holding bottled water. "Oh," he said quickly. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize those papers were left out." I looked directly at him. "What exactly are these?" The poor man suddenly looked uncomfortable. His eyes darted briefly toward the living room where Ava and Daniel continued talking. Then back to me. I assumed your son already discussed everything with you, he said carefully. Discussed? My chest tightened harder. Discussed what? Before he could answer, Ava appeared in the doorway, smiling too brightly. There you are, she interrupted smoothly. We were wondering where you disappeared to. I held her gaze. The realtor was just explaining these documents. For the first time since arriving in Florida, something close to panic flickered behind her eyes. Only for a second, then gone. Oh, that, she said lightly. It's nothing finalized. Just future planning. Future planning. Another polite phrase hiding something ugly underneath. Daniel finally walked into the kitchen too. His expression changed immediately when he saw the folder in my hands. Mom. That one word told me everything. He knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. How long have you been discussing selling my house? I asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Outside, waves crashed softly against the shore. Inside, the silence felt enormous. Finally, Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when nervous. We were only trying to think ahead, he said carefully. You're alone in Ohio now. The winters are hard. We thought maybe being closer to us would make sense eventually. Closer to them. Except they barely tolerated me during a 4-day vacation. Ava stepped forward gently. We're worried about you, Linda. Linda again. Not Mom. Not family. Just Linda. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. At the tired lines around his eyes. At the guilt he kept trying not to show. And suddenly, a memory surfaced so clearly it almost hurt. Daniel at 7 years old. Standing in our kitchen after a nightmare. Small hands clutching my robe while he cried because he was afraid monsters were hiding in his closet. Back then, I was the person who made him feel safe. Now I was a problem he and his wife were trying to solve quietly. Something inside me shifted then. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just clear. Because for the first time, I realized this trip was never really a vacation. It was an intervention. And I was the only person who hadn't known it. I didn't say another word during the drive back to the resort. Neither did Daniel. The children had fallen asleep in the back seat, their sunburned cheeks pressed against travel pillows while the Florida sunlight flashed across the SUV windows. Ava kept talking, though. She talked the way people do when silence makes them nervous. About the weather. About property values. About how practical it would be for everyone if I relocated closer to them. Practical. That word followed me all afternoon like a mosquito I couldn't swat away. I stared quietly out the window while rows of palm trees blurred past beside the highway. 36 years in that Ohio house. 36 Christmas mornings. 36 springs watching Harold trim roses in the front yard. And somehow my entire life had been reduced to a practical conversation inside a luxury SUV. When we returned to the resort, Ava announced that the children wanted to spend the afternoon at the pool. Daniel looked exhausted. I might stay upstairs for a while, he muttered. Ava barely acknowledged him. Fine, she said. But dinner's at 7. Don't disappear. Don't disappear. Interesting choice of words from a woman who'd spent years slowly erasing me from my own family. I told them I needed rest and headed toward my room alone. The hallway felt colder than before. Or maybe I had finally stopped trying to convince myself this trip was normal. Inside my room, I sat carefully on the edge of the bed without even removing my shoes. The folder, the papers, the senior living brochures. Everything kept replaying inside my mind. Not once had Daniel asked what I wanted. Not once had anyone considered that the house meant more than square footage and resale value. People who inherit memories too easily never understand the weight of losing them. Around 4 o'clock, someone knocked softly on my door. For a moment, I assumed it was Daniel. Maybe guilt had finally reached him. But when I opened the door, I found the young resort clerk from check-in standing there holding a small paper bag. The same girl Ava whispered to on our first day. She looked nervous. Mrs. Carter? She asked gently. Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. One of the restaurant servers said you skipped lunch, so I brought extra key lime pastries from the cafe downstairs. I blinked in surprise. That's very kind of you. She smiled awkwardly. My grandmother travels alone sometimes, she explained quietly. I guess you reminded me of her. For the first time since arriving in Florida, somebody looked at me with uncomplicated kindness. No obligation. No pity. Just kindness. I invited her inside for a moment. Her name was Emily, 23 years old. working summers at the resort before starting graduate school in Tampa. She noticed the untouched brochures scattered across my bed almost immediately. Then her expression changed slightly. Not curious, concerned. I hope I'm not overstepping, she said carefully. But are you okay? Such a simple question. And somehow it nearly broke me, because nobody in my own family had asked it once. I sat down slowly in the armchair beside the window. I'm beginning to think my family brought me on this trip for reasons I didn't understand, I admitted quietly. Emily hesitated before speaking again. Actually, she said softly, there's something I thought maybe you should know. A cold feeling crept through my stomach. What is it? She lowered her voice instinctively, even though we were alone. The morning you arrived, your daughter-in-law stopped by the front desk before check-in. I felt my chest tighten immediately. She asked us several questions about assisted living communities nearby. Emily continued carefully. At first I assumed she was researching for a relative, but then she specifically requested brochures about long-term senior suites connected to the resort properties. Senior suites. The room suddenly felt smaller. Emily looked uncomfortable now, as if she regretted saying anything. She also asked whether older guests could be moved permanently into extended stay units without managing the reservations themselves. I stared at her. She asked that. Emily nodded slowly. And yesterday morning, I overheard her speaking with one of the real estate agents in the lobby cafe. She said something about needing everything finalized before winter because your Ohio house would sell fast once the market reopened. My Ohio house. Not my home. Not Harold's house. Just an asset waiting to be liquidated. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The ocean waves crashed faintly outside, while sunlight stretched across the carpet near my feet. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. The invitation. The fake concern. The property tours. The constant comments about loneliness and aging. This wasn't family bonding. They were preparing to relocate me like furniture. Emily looked genuinely upset now. I'm sorry, she whispered. I probably shouldn't have said anything. No, I said quietly. I'm glad you did. And I meant it. Because truth hurts less than confusion. Eventually, confusion keeps hope alive longer than it deserves. Emily stood to leave a few moments later, but before reaching the door, she paused. My grandmother always says something interesting, she told me softly. She says when people start treating you like you're powerless, it usually means they're afraid you're not. Then she smiled gently and disappeared into the hallway. I sat there motionless long after she left. Powerless. Was that what Daniel and Ava thought I'd become? An old widow too tired to question paperwork, too lonely to resist manipulation, too emotional to notice she was being managed instead of loved. Slowly, I looked toward the folder still lying open on the bed. For the first time since Harold died, I suddenly missed not just my husband, but the woman I used to be when he was alive. Because Harold never let anyone make me feel small. Not once in 42 years. If someone interrupted me at dinner, he redirected the conversation back toward me. If I doubted myself, he reminded me exactly who I was. And if anyone had ever called me just the old woman, Harold would have ended the conversation immediately. But Harold was gone. And somewhere over the past 3 years, I had slowly allowed myself to disappear with him. A soft notification buzzed from my phone beside the bed. A new family group message from Ava. Dinner changed to 8 p.m. Don't be late this time. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. 2 years earlier, after Harold's funeral, Daniel had insisted on helping organize our financial documents. At least let me make things easier for you, Mom, he'd said kindly. At the time, I was too numb with grief to question anything. But now I remembered something strange. Harold's attorney had looked uncomfortable that day. Very uncomfortable. At the time, I assumed it was sympathy. Now I wasn't so sure anymore. And for the first time since arriving in Florida, a new thought entered my mind. What if this vacation wasn't the beginning of their plan? What if it was simply the final stage of something they had already started years ago? I didn't go to dinner at 8. For the first time since arriving at the resort, I simply ignored Ava's message. No apology. No explanation. I stayed inside my room while evening rain tapped softly against the balcony railing outside. The sky had turned dark gray over the Gulf, and distant thunder rolled across the water like something heavy approaching slowly. It matched my mood perfectly. I sat at the small desk near the window with Harold's old leather notebook open in front of me. After he died, I started writing things down whenever my thoughts became too loud. Groceries, bills, memories. Sometimes grief feels less dangerous when trapped on paper. Tonight, though, I wasn't writing memories. I was making a list. Things Daniel handled after Harold's funeral. Bank accounts, insurance paperwork, property documents, the trust. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one final sentence. Why was Harold's lawyer uncomfortable? I stared at the question for a long time. Then I reached for my phone. At first, I almost changed my mind. It was late, and after 3 years, calling Harold's attorney out of nowhere would probably seem strange. But something deep inside me had finally awakened. Not anger. Instinct. The same instinct women develop after surviving decades of disappointment without collapsing from it. I found the number saved in my contacts under Martin Feldman, estate attorney. My fingers hesitated briefly before pressing call. To my surprise, he answered on the second ring. Mrs. Carter? His voice sounded older than I remembered. Tired. Martin, I said quietly. I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all. A pause followed. Is everything all right? Interesting question. Not how are you? Not polite small talk. Is everything all right? As if part of him already knew the answer. I looked toward the rain sliding down the balcony glass. I'm in Florida with Daniel and his family, I said carefully. And today I discovered they've been discussing selling my home without speaking to me first. Silence. Long enough to matter. Then Martin sighed softly. The kind of sigh people make when a truth they hope to avoid finally arrives anyway. Linda, he said gently, there are some things I've been uncomfortable about. For quite some time. My stomach tightened immediately. Outside, lightning flashed faintly across the distant ocean. What things? Another pause. Then, would it be possible for us to speak privately tomorrow morning? Cold spread slowly through my chest. What aren't you telling me, Martin? His voice lowered. When Harold updated the trust before his death, he included several protections regarding the house and your long-term financial security. Protections. The word hit me hard. Daniel never mentioned protections. I know. I closed my eyes briefly. Rain continued falling steadily outside while the air conditioner hummed softly behind me. Martin, I whispered, did my son try to change something after Harold died? Silence again. That terrible silence people use when the truth itself feels dangerous. Finally, he answered carefully. Not directly, but there was pressure. Pressure. Such a small word for betrayal. I gripped the edge of the desk tighter. What kind of pressure? He wanted broader authority over certain financial decisions while you were grieving, Martin admitted quietly. Mostly framed as helping you manage things. Helping. Always helping. That word was starting to sound poisonous. I remembered those first months after Harold died. The fog I lived inside. I barely slept. Barely ate. Sometimes I forgot what day it was. Daniel handled everything then. Bank meetings. Paperwork. Insurance calls. At the time, I thought I was lucky to have such a devoted son. Now my stomach churned remembering how often Ava attended those meetings too. Always smiling softly. Always bringing coffee. Always speaking for Daniel whenever conversations became uncomfortable. Did I sign anything? I asked suddenly. Martin hesitated. Yes. The room seemed to tilt slightly. But before you panic, he added quickly, nothing transferred ownership of the home itself. Harold made sure that couldn't happen. Couldn't happen. Meaning someone had tried. I swallowed hard. Then why are they acting like they can move me into senior housing? This time Martin answered immediately. Because they believe eventually you'll agree voluntarily. Voluntarily. That word hurt worst. Of all. Not because they planned to force me. Because they believed loneliness would make me surrender willingly. I stared across the dark room toward my packed suitcase near the door. Suddenly the entire vacation looked different. The resort tours. The comments about aging. The emotional pressure. Even the separate hotel room. Isolation weakens people. Especially grieving people. Martin spoke again carefully. Linda, has Daniel mentioned the discretionary access clause? I frowned. The what? Another heavy pause. Then, if you permanently relocate into assisted living or long-term managed care, certain trust controls shift automatically to the secondary family trustees. I felt my heartbeat slow painfully. Secondary trustees. I repeated quietly. Yes. Who? I already knew. But hearing it mattered. Martin's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Daniel and Ava. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe properly. The rain outside grew harder now. striking the balcony glass in sharp, uneven rhythms. Everything suddenly connected with horrifying clarity. They didn't just want me out of the house. They wanted control. Control of the trust. Control of Harold's assets. Control of every decision attached to my future. And the cruelest part? They planned to accomplish it by convincing me it was for my own good. A soft knock interrupted the conversation suddenly. 3 light taps at my hotel door. I flinched instinctively. "Someone's here," I murmured. "Linda," Martin said quickly before I could hang up. "Do not sign anything else during this trip. Nothing. And when you return home, we need to review every document together privately." Privately, meaning away from Daniel and Ava. "I understand." I ended the call slowly and walked toward the door. My pulse pounded harder with every step. When I opened it, Daniel stood outside alone. For the first time all week, he actually looked nervous. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath a wrinkled polo shirt, and dark circles rested beneath his eyes. "You missed dinner," he said quietly. "I know." He glanced past me into the room as though checking whether I'd been crying. I hadn't. Something deeper than sadness had replaced tears. Now, guilt flickered briefly across his face. Ava got upset. Of course she did. Everything always circled back to Ava somehow. I folded my arms gently. "Daniel," I asked softly, "did you invite me on this trip because you wanted to spend time with me?" His expression changed immediately, just for a second, but long enough. People can lie with words. Their faces usually tell the truth first. "Mom." That one word sounded exhausted. Cornered. I watched him carefully beneath the soft hallway lighting. The little boy who once cried during thunderstorms was gone. In his place stood a man quietly choosing comfort over conscience. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I stopped seeing my son as someone being manipulated by his wife. Because manipulation only works when someone wants the benefits badly enough. "No," I said quietly before he could answer. "Don't explain. I think I finally understand." Daniel stood outside my hotel room for several seconds after I said that. "I think I finally understand." The hallway between us felt strangely quiet. Somewhere downstairs, faint piano music drifted upward from the resort bar. Ice machines hummed behind closed doors. An elevator bell dinged softly at the far end of the corridor. Ordinary sounds. But nothing inside me felt ordinary anymore. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face slowly. He looked tired. Older somehow. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the folder. The trust. The senior living brochures. And the pity disappeared. "Mom," he said quietly, "it's not what you think." Interesting thing about betrayal. Everyone says that exact sentence eventually. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "You were right." Just, "It's not what you think." As if confusion hurts less than honesty. I leaned lightly against the doorway. "Then tell me what it is." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. Behind him, the hallway lights reflected softly against polished walls while rain continued tapping somewhere outside the resort windows. Finally, he sighed heavily. "You've been alone a long time," he said carefully. "After Dad passed, things changed." Things changed. Another soft phrase hiding something ugly. Underneath. "Yes," I answered calmly. "Widowhood tends to do that." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not fair." I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because fairness suddenly seemed like such a strange word coming from him. "For 3 years," I said quietly, "I spent holidays alone while you vacationed with Ava's family. I watched my own grandchildren slowly become strangers. And now I discover you've been discussing my future behind my back." Daniel looked down at the carpet. Not denying it. Just avoiding it. "I was trying to protect you." Protect me. There it was again. That poisonous little word. I folded my arms gently. From what exactly? This time he hesitated longer. Then, from ending up alone. The answer hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel. Because part of him genuinely believed it. I studied my son's face carefully. The exhaustion. The guilt. The fear. And underneath all of it, relief. Relief that someone else, Ava, made the hard decisions for him. Suddenly, I understood their marriage better than I ever had before. Ava controlled things. Daniel surrendered to it. Not because he was weak exactly. Because responsibility frightened him. It always had. Even as a child, Daniel hated conflict. If neighborhood boys argued during baseball games, he walked away. If teachers raised their voices, he apologized even when he'd done nothing wrong. And after Harold died, Ava stepped naturally into the empty space where strength used to live. Only her version of strength looked a lot like control. I need some sleep, I said finally. Daniel looked startled. That's it. What else is there to say? For the first time all week, genuine emotion flashed across his face. Pain. Mom, his voice cracked slightly. And suddenly I saw him again, not as the middle-aged man helping his wife manage me, but as the little boy who once climbed into my bed after nightmares. For one dangerous second, my heart softened. That's the problem with motherhood. Even after betrayal, part of you still wants to comfort your child. But then I remembered something Martin said. They believe eventually you'll agree voluntarily. And my softness disappeared. Again, you should go back to your wife, I said quietly. Daniel stared at me for another moment before nodding slowly. Then he turned and walked down the hallway without another word. I watched him disappear around the corner. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized something devastating. Loving someone deeply does not guarantee they will protect you. Sometimes it only guarantees how badly they can hurt you. I barely slept again that night. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up entirely and walked down to the beach alone. The storm had passed. The sand still felt damp beneath my sandals, while pale gray light stretched slowly across the horizon. The ocean looked endless in the early morning darkness. Quiet, powerful, indifferent. I sat on a lounge chair wrapped in one of the resort towels and listened to waves break against the shore. Harold loved mornings like this. He used to wake me before sunrise during vacations just to drink coffee beside the water. Most people sleep through the best part of the day, he always said. For years after he died, I avoided beaches entirely. The memories hurt too much. But sitting there alone beneath the fading storm clouds, I suddenly felt closer to him than I had in months. Not because of grief. Because for the first time since losing him, I was finally forced to stand on my own again. No illusions. No comforting lies. Just truth. My phone buzzed softly beside me around 6:30. A text from Ava. Breakfast moved to 9. Please try to be on time today. The realtor reserved lunch after. Please try to be on time. As if I were a difficult child. I stared at the message briefly. Then another arrived seconds later. Also, we may stop by a senior community nearby afterward. Just to explore options while we're here. My stomach turned cold instantly. Not even pretending anymore. Just openly scheduling my future. I looked back toward the ocean while gulls circled overhead beneath the growing sunrise. Then slowly, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling hurt. Not completely, but enough. Because pain eventually reaches a limit. After that, clarity takes over. And clarity is dangerous. Especially to people counting on your weakness. By the time I returned to the resort, the lobby buzzed with families checking out and tourists dragging oversized suitcases across marble floors. I stopped briefly near the cafe to buy coffee. That's when I overheard Ava's voice again. She sat near the windows speaking quietly to another woman from the resort tour group. Honestly, once Linda relocates, everything gets easier, Ava was saying casually. Daniel's father tied up too much money in that trust. It's ridiculous. The woman looked uncomfortable. Well, it is her house. Ava laughed lightly. For now. I stood perfectly still behind the cafe wall. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. She's emotional lately, Ava continued. But Daniel knows what's best. Once we get her settled somewhere smaller, things can finally move forward. Move forward. As if my existence itself had become an obstacle standing in the way of their perfect life. The other woman shifted awkwardly. And Linda knows all this. Ava took a slow sip of coffee. She'll understand eventually. That sentence settled something permanently inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Something colder. Resolve. Because in that moment, I finally understood the real danger of people like Ava. They don't think they're villains. They think they're justified. And justified people rarely notice the cruelty in what they're doing. I walked away before she saw me. Back upstairs in my room, I locked the door carefully behind me. Then I picked up my phone and called Martin again. This time, when he answered, my voice sounded calm. Steadier than before. Martin, I said quietly. I think it's time you explained every single thing my husband protected me from. Martin called me back 20 minutes later. By then, I had changed clothes and closed the balcony curtains against the bright Florida sun. The resort room suddenly felt less like a vacation suite and more like a place where difficult truths waited quietly behind every conversation. I sat at the small desk with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside me. Linda, Martin said carefully, before we discuss anything else, I need to ask you something directly. All right. Do Daniel and Ava know you contacted me? No, good. That single word sent a chill through me. Good. Not unnecessary. Not harmless. Good. Outside my window, I could hear children laughing near the pool. Somewhere below, music drifted upward from the beach bar, while people continued enjoying their vacations. Meanwhile, my own family was quietly planning my future like a business arrangement. Martin cleared his throat softly. Your husband became concerned about certain things during the last year of his life. I gripped the phone tighter. What things? Another pause. Then, he believed Daniel was becoming financially dependent on Ava's spending habits. I closed my eyes briefly. That didn't surprise me. Ava loved appearances, luxury handbags, private schools, vacation photos designed to look effortless even though nothing about their lifestyle actually was. Over the years, Daniel changed too. Nicer cars, more expensive watches, constant conversations about investments and status. Harold noticed everything long before I did. He didn't dislike Ava, Martin continued carefully, but he worried she viewed family assets differently than he did. Family assets. Such a cold phrase for the things people build over entire lifetimes. The trust was revised 6 months before Harold passed away, Martin explained. Most of the protections focused specifically on your right to remain financially independent. Independent. That word nearly made me cry. Not because I felt weak. Because Harold had seen this coming while I was still blind to it. What protections? I asked quietly. Martin lowered his voice slightly. The Ohio house cannot legally be sold without your direct written approval, certified privately, without family present. I sat very still. And if any relative attempts to pressure, manipulate, or misrepresent financial information regarding your residency or care decisions, they can temporarily lose trustee privileges entirely. My heartbeat slowed. They can lose access? Yes. I stared toward the closed curtains while sunlight glowed softly around the edges. Harold knew. Somehow, before he died, my husband understood exactly what kind of future might eventually surround me. Not open cruelty. Managed dependence. That hurt more somehow. Because manipulation wrapped in concern is harder to recognize until it's already happening. Martin, I whispered, did Harold think Daniel would betray me? No, he answered immediately. Never betrayal. The sadness in his voice sounded genuine. But he worried Daniel was too easily influenced by people who confused control with love. I thought about Ava carefully managing every conversation during this trip. Every meal, every schedule, every decision. Even Daniel's opinions often sounded borrowed lately. He wanted to believe Daniel would protect you eventually, Martin continued. But he also wanted safeguards in case grief made you vulnerable. Vulnerable. I remembered those first months after Harold's funeral again. Sleeping on the couch because our bedroom felt unbearable. Forgetting to eat meals. Signing papers without reading carefully because concentrating hurt too much. Ava sitting beside me with soft, sympathetic smiles while Daniel handled documents. The realization made my stomach twist painfully. Not because they technically broke laws. Because they waited until I was emotionally shattered. And part of me had trusted them completely. Linda, Martin said gently, there's something else you should know. The room suddenly felt colder. What? Ava requested copies of several trust summaries last year. I frowned immediately. She shouldn't have access to those. She didn't receive full copies, he clarified quickly. But Daniel requested clarification meetings, and Ava attended with him. Of course she did. I could picture it perfectly now. Ava sitting elegantly across polished conference tables, asking careful questions in that calm, reasonable voice of hers. Not emotional. Not aggressive. Just strategic. People underestimate calm women. Especially the dangerous ones. Did Daniel know about the assisted living clause? I asked quietly. Martin hesitated. Yes. The word landed heavily inside my chest. Not suspicion anymore. Not confusion. Truth. My son knew exactly what relocating me would trigger financially. I stood slowly and walked toward the balcony window. Beyond the glass, waves rolled peacefully against the shoreline while tourists lounged beneath umbrellas without a care in the world. Life continues normally even while your heart rearranges itself. That's the strange part. Martin, I said finally, if Harold protected me so carefully, Why didn't he tell me everything directly? This time Martin's voice softened. Because he loved Daniel. Tears finally burned behind my eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. He hoped none of these protections would ever matter, Martin continued. He believed grief might pass, family would heal, and everyone would do the right thing naturally. I laughed softly through the ache in my chest. Harold always believed people were better than they actually were, especially where Daniel was concerned. Before hanging up, Martin gave me one final piece of advice. Do not confront them emotionally, he warned gently. People reveal much more when they think you still trust them. After the call ended, I sat alone for a very long time thinking about that sentence. People reveal much more when they think you still trust them. Downstairs, another notification buzzed inside the family group chat. Ava had posted the day's schedule. Lunch with realtor. Tour at Seaside Senior Residences. Sunset dinner reservation at 7. She actually wrote it openly now. Seaside Senior Residences. Like I was already halfway moved in. I stared at the message calmly. Then, for the first time all week, I smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly I understood something important. Ava believed the hardest part was already over. She thought humiliation had weakened me. She thought loneliness made me dependent. She thought age made me easy to manage. And Daniel thought avoiding conflict would protect him from consequences. Neither of them realized something dangerous about women who survive long marriages, grief, childbirth, financial hardship, and decades of sacrifice. We learn how to endure quietly, but we also learn how to wait. Around noon, I finally went downstairs to meet them in the lobby. Ava looked relieved the moment she saw me approaching. Probably because I appeared calm again. Controlled. Predictable. Exactly the version of me she preferred. There she is, Ava said brightly. Ready for a productive afternoon? Productive. As if they were scheduling meetings instead of dismantling my life. I smiled gently. Of course. Daniel studied my face carefully, maybe searching for signs that I knew more than I should. But I gave him nothing. That seemed to relax him. Good. Because Martin was right. Sometimes silence tells people exactly what they want to believe. And what Ava believed in that moment was that I was finally cooperating. The senior living community sat less than 15 minutes from the resort. Seaside Senior Residences. Even the name sounded carefully designed to soften the truth. Not assisted living. Not retirement housing. Residences. As if changing the wording made people less afraid of ending up there. The building itself was beautiful. Bright white walls. Palm trees lining the entrance. A fountain bubbling peacefully near the circular driveway. Everything looked clean, expensive, comfortable, and strangely empty. A smiling woman in a pale blue blazer greeted us the moment we entered the lobby. You must be the Carter family, she said warmly. Family. Interesting how strangers used that word more kindly than my own son had lately. I'm Denise. We spoke on the phone earlier this week. So Ava had planned this before we even arrived in Florida. I glanced toward Daniel. He avoided eye contact immediately. Of course he did. Denise began leading us through the property while speaking in the same calm tone nurses use around nervous patients. Our residents enjoy full independence while having support available if needed. Residents. Not people. Not mothers. Residents. I walked quietly beside them while Ava asked questions about dining packages, transportation services, and medical staff availability. Not once did she ask whether I liked the place. At one point, Sophie slipped her hand into mine while the adults talked ahead of us. Grandma, she whispered softly. Are you going to live here? Children ask questions adults hide behind polite language. I looked down at her small worried face. I don't know yet, sweetheart. Sophie frowned slightly. But your house has the big garden Grandpa built. My throat tightened instantly. Yes, the garden. Harold's roses still climbed the white fence every summer. Yellow tulips bloomed beside the mailbox every April. And every winter, I still hung the same Christmas wreath Harold bought 20 years earlier from a church fundraiser downtown. People who call a house property never understand those things. To them, walls are investments. To the rest of us, they're evidence that our lives mattered. We toured model apartments next. Small kitchens, compact bathrooms with handrails, emergency pull cords beside every bed. Everything looked safe, prepared, temporary. The kind of place people move into when the world slowly stops expecting them to keep living fully. Denise smiled warmly while showing us one of the balcony units. Many residents say downsizing gives them freedom, she explained. Less stress. Less isolation. Isolation. That word again. Ava nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what we've been worried about. We. As if concern automatically erased manipulation. I wandered quietly toward the balcony overlooking the courtyard below. A few elderly residents sat together near a shuffleboard court while a staff member handed out lemonade beneath striped umbrellas. Some looked content enough. Others looked abandoned. You can always tell the difference. The content ones still carried purpose in their posture. The abandoned ones stared at doors too often. Waiting becomes a habit after certain ages. Behind me, Ava continued speaking softly with Denise. Linda struggles after losing her husband, she explained carefully. And honestly, managing finances alone has become overwhelming for her. I froze. Managing finances? Interesting lie. Harold handled most investments during our marriage, yes. But after his death, I managed every utility bill, insurance payment, tax appointment, and mortgage document without missing a single deadline. The only people acting like I was incapable were the people hoping to gain control if I believed it too. Denise nodded sympathetically. We see that often. Of course they did. Entire industries exist around. Convincing older people that dependence is inevitable. Daniel finally spoke then. His voice sounded strained. Maybe we're moving too fast. Ava's head turned sharply toward him. Not enough for others to notice. Enough for me. That tiny flicker of irritation crossing her face lasted less than a second before disappearing behind another soft smile. We're just exploring options, she said smoothly. Exploring. Another harmless word carrying dangerous intentions. But Daniel's hesitation mattered. Not because it erased anything. Because guilt was finally becoming harder for him to ignore. The tour ended in a bright dining hall overlooking the water. Residents sat eating soup and sandwiches beneath cheerful paintings of sailboats and sunsets. Everything smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and overcooked vegetables. Denise handed Ava a folder near the exit. Pricing plans. Deposit structures. Waitlist options. My future reduced to paperwork again. Then Denise turned toward me kindly. And what do you think, Mrs. Carter? The entire group looked at me suddenly. For the first time all afternoon, someone had actually asked my opinion. I studied the room carefully before answering. It's very beautiful, I said honestly. Because it was. Then I smiled gently. But I'm not finished living yet. Denise blinked in surprise. Daniel looked down immediately. And Ava? Ava laughed softly. Oh, Linda, nobody's saying your life is over. No, they were just trying to make it smaller. That evening, the resort hosted an outdoor seafood dinner beside the beach. String lights glowed above white-clothed tables, while a jazz trio played softly near the dunes. Tourists laughed beneath the warm Florida night air, sipping wine while waves rolled quietly behind them. Everything looked elegant, peaceful, manufactured. Ava spent most of dinner posting photos online again. Perfect family vacation. Blessed. Making memories. Funny how social media always captures smiling faces, but never the conversations happening underneath them. At one point, Mason accidentally spilled butter across the tablecloth. Ava sighed dramatically. Oh my God, she muttered. I swear I'm taking care of children and seniors at the same time this week. The comment slipped out casually. Quickly. But I heard it. So did Daniel. An uncomfortable silence followed. Then something surprising happened. Sophie looked directly at her mother and frowned. That's mean. The table went completely still. Ava blinked. What? You keep talking about Grandma like she's a problem, Sophie said quietly. Children notice more than adults think. Ava forced a small laugh. Sophie, don't be dramatic. But Sophie didn't smile back. She misses Grandpa, she said softly. And you're always rude to her. For the first time since arriving in Florida, real tension cracked openly across the table. Daniel looked trapped. Ava looked embarrassed. And I suddenly realized something important. The performance was beginning to slip. Because manipulative people depend on silence. And silence becomes harder to maintain once someone finally says the ugly part out loud. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Sophie said that. You keep talking about Grandma like she's a problem. The jazz music continued softly in the background while waves rolled against the shore behind us. Nearby tables kept laughing and clinking wine glasses, completely unaware that my family was quietly cracking apart beneath the string lights. Ava recovered first. Manipulative people usually do. She leaned back in her chair and laughed softly like Sophie had said something adorable instead of painfully honest. "Oh, sweetheart," she said smoothly. "I'm just tired. Adults joke sometimes." But Sophie didn't smile. At 12 years old, she already had Harold's eyes. The kind that notice things people try to hide. "It didn't sound like a joke," she murmured. Daniel rubbed his forehead heavily. "Mason," he said suddenly, too loudly. "Why don't you show me those seashells you collected earlier?" Deflection. Another family specialty. Mason immediately started digging through his pockets while Ava forced another brittle smile across the table. And me? I simply sat there quietly folding my napkin across my lap. Because for the first time since this trip began, I realized something important. I wasn't the only person noticing the truth anymore. Children always sense tension before adults admit it exists. Dinner ended awkwardly after that. Ava claimed she had a headache. Daniel barely spoke. Sophie stayed unusually quiet walking back through the resort pathways, while Mason chased lizards near the palm trees, blissfully unaware of everything happening around him. As we entered the hotel lobby, Ava suddenly stopped near the elevators. "I forgot my sweater at the restaurant," she announced quickly. "Daniel, come with me." Interesting. She never needed help retrieving forgotten items before. Daniel hesitated briefly, then followed her anyway. Of course he did. The elevator doors opened behind me with a soft ding. "Grandma." I looked down. Sophie stood beside me clutching her sandals in one hand. "Can I stay in your room for a little while?" Something inside my chest softened immediately. "Of course, sweetheart." 10 minutes later, Sophie sat cross-legged on the bed eating chocolates from the welcome basket while I made hot tea in the tiny hotel coffee machine. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, without looking up, she asked, "Is Mom trying to send you away?" The question nearly broke my heart. Not because it was cruel, because children should never understand family politics that young. I carried the tea carefully to the small table beside the window. "Why would you ask that?" Sophie shrugged awkwardly. "She talks about it with Dad when they think nobody hears." My stomach tightened. "She says you'd be happier somewhere people can watch you properly." Watch me. Like I was becoming something fragile. Something inconvenient. Sophie twisted the edge of the blanket nervously. "But Grandpa promised you'd always stay in your house." I looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She blinked innocently. "Before he died, I heard him talking to Dad in the garage one time." Every nerve in my body suddenly sharpened. "What did he say?" Sophie frowned, trying to remember. "I don't know everything." But Grandpa sounded upset. She paused. "He told Dad the house was yours no matter what happened. And he said if anybody ever tried making you leave," she hesitated again, "he said he'd make sure they regretted it." Hey. Chill moved slowly down my spine. Harold knew. Not just generally. Specifically. I sat very still beside the window while Sophie continued nibbling chocolate absent-mindedly. Children remember strange details adults overlook. A sentence. A tone of voice. An argument overheard accidentally through cracked doors. "Did your mom hear that conversation too?" I asked carefully. Sophie nodded slowly. "I think so." Of course she did. That explained Ava's frustration perfectly. Harold built protections she couldn't fully control, and now she was trying to maneuver around them emotionally instead. The realization settled heavily inside me. Not sudden anymore. Not shocking. Just clear. A soft knock interrupted us around 10:30. 3 quick taps. Sophie immediately stiffened beside me. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there alone again. His eyes moved briefly towards Sophie sitting inside. "Ava's wondering where she is." Interesting. Not worried. Wondering. Sophie slid off the bed slowly. "I'm coming." But before leaving, she wrapped her arms around my waist unexpectedly. A real hug. Tight. Warm. For one dangerous second, tears burned behind my eyes again. "Good night, Grandma," she whispered softly. Then she followed Daniel into the hallway. But before the door closed completely, I heard something else. Sophie's quiet voice. "Dad, why is Mom always mean to Grandma?" Silence followed. Long silence. Then Daniel answered softly enough that he probably thought I couldn't hear. "She's not trying to be mean." Not. She isn't mean. Just, she's not trying to be. Even he couldn't fully defend her anymore. That night, I slept better than I had since arriving in Florida. Not peacefully, but clearly. There's a difference. By morning, the confusion was gone completely. In its place sat something colder. Awareness. I woke early again and walked downstairs before sunrise, carrying Harold's leather notebook beneath my arm. The beach was almost empty except for joggers and a few elderly couples collecting shells near the shoreline. I sat beneath a blue umbrella watching the ocean while writing quietly inside the notebook. Not memories this time. Evidence. Everything Ava said. Everything Daniel avoided saying. Every financial conversation. Every contradiction. Grief teaches women how to survive emotional pain. But age teaches something even more valuable. Observation. After 70 years, you learn people reveal themselves most clearly when they think you're too weak to matter. Around 8:30, my phone buzzed with another message from Ava. Breakfast at 9:30. Realtor meeting afterward finalized. Finalized. Interesting word. Not discussion. Not exploration. Finalized. A few minutes later, another message appeared underneath it. Also bring your ID and insurance information. Denise requested copies for preliminary paperwork. Preliminary paperwork. I stared at the screen for several seconds while ocean waves crashed steadily nearby. Then slowly, I smiled, because Ava had finally made a mistake. For days, she carefully disguised everything as concern. Suggestions, conversations, possibilities. But now she was rushing. And people who rush eventually become careless. I closed Harold's notebook calmly and stood from the beach chair. Then I picked up my phone and called Martin one more time. When he answered, I spoke quietly. Martin, I said, if someone intentionally pressures a widow into assisted living to trigger trust access, what happens when it's proven? The silence on the other end lasted only 2 seconds this time. Then Martin answered very carefully. Everything changes. By the time I walked into the resort restaurant that morning, Ava already looked irritated. Not openly. Ava rarely lost control in public. But I noticed the tiny signs now. The stiffness around her smile. The way her fingernails tapped lightly against her coffee cup. The quick glance toward her watched the moment she saw me approaching. People become predictable once you stop viewing them through love. There you are, she said brightly. We were starting to worry. Worry. Another word that sounded kinder than it really was. Daniel sat across from her staring down at his untouched breakfast while the children quietly picked at pancakes beside him. Nobody looked rested. Not even Ava. Good. I slid calmly into my chair and unfolded my napkin. Sorry, I said. Pleasantly. I took a walk on the beach. Ava exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. Then she smiled again. Well, after breakfast, we should probably head over to finish paperwork with Denise. Finish paperwork. Not discuss. Not review. Finish. I poured cream into my coffee slowly. What paperwork exactly? Ava answered too quickly. Nothing binding yet. Just preliminary information so they can reserve availability. Reserve availability. As if I were booking a cruise cabin instead of discussing the final years of my life. Daniel finally spoke quietly. We don't have to decide anything today. Interesting. Yesterday, he stayed silent. Today, he sounded uncertain. Pressure changes people once guilt begins catching up to them. Ava's smile tightened slightly. Well, obviously, she said lightly. But these places have waiting lists. I looked directly at her. Why are you in such a hurry to move me out of my home? The table went completely silent. Even Mason stopped chewing. Nearby tourists continued eating omelets and drinking mimosas beneath the soft jazz music floating through the restaurant. Meanwhile, my family looked like someone had shattered glass in the middle of breakfast. Ava blinked twice, then laughed softly again. Olinda, nobody's trying to move you out. Not denying it, just softening it. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Then why did you schedule property tours before telling me? No answer. Why did you ask resort staff about extended senior housing? Daniel looked up sharply toward Ava. Interesting. He didn't know I knew that part. And why? I continued quietly. Were you requesting trust paperwork last year? Now both of them froze. The shift in Ava's face lasted less than a second. But it was enough. Fear. Real fear this time. Who have you been talking to? She asked carefully. Notice that. Not. That isn't true. Just. Who told you? I took a slow sip of coffee. Does it matter? Daniel looked pale suddenly. Mom. No, I interrupted gently. I'd like to hear her answer first. For the first time since arriving in Florida, Ava lost control of the performance slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. Her voice sharpened around the edges. We've been trying to help you. There it was again. Help. That poisonous little word wrapped around manipulation like ribbon around a knife. I never asked for help. I said calmly. You needed it. The sentence slipped out too quickly, too honestly. Even Ava seemed to realize it immediately afterward, because suddenly the table felt colder. Sophie stared down at her plate. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. And me? I felt strangely peaceful, because once people stop pretending, the truth becomes much easier to survive. Ava leaned forward, lowering her voice. You're alone in that giant house, Linda. You barely socialize. You still keep Harold's clothes hanging in the closet 3 years later. I said nothing. So yes, she continued carefully. Daniel and I became concerned. Concerned. Interesting how concern always seemed to involve my finances. My house. My trust. Never my actual happiness. I looked toward my son. Are you concerned about me, Daniel? He opened his mouth slowly, then stopped. That silence answered everything. Ava jumped in immediately. Of course he is. But Daniel still hadn't spoken. Because deep down, even he knew this stopped being about concern a long time ago. Finally, very quietly, he admitted, we thought maybe this would be easier eventually. Easier. Not better for me. Better for them. The honesty in that single sentence settled over the table like fog. Mason looked confused now. Are we talking about Grandma moving away? Nobody answered him. Children always hear the truth first. Ava inhaled slowly, trying to regain control again. Linda, she said in her calm, practiced voice, you're turning this into something ugly. I almost smiled. No. What made this ugly was the manipulation, the lying, the quiet meetings behind my back while pretending this was family bonding. I reached calmly into my purse and removed Harold's leather notebook. Then I slid a folded paper across the table toward Daniel. Martin emailed it an hour earlier. A summary of the trust protections. Daniel unfolded the paper slowly. As he read, the color drained visibly from his face. Ava leaned closer beside him. Then her expression changed too. Sharp, cold, panicked. Because now they understood something important. I knew. Not emotionally. Legally. You talked to Martin? Daniel whispered. Yes. Ava sat back immediately. This is unbelievable. Interesting reaction. Not shame. Not regret. Anger. People become angry when plans stop working. I looked directly at her. You scheduled senior housing tours before discussing them honestly with me. You were too emotional after Harold died to think clearly, she snapped suddenly. The words landed hard across the table. Even Ava seemed shocked she'd said them out loud. Daniel stared at her. Sophie and Mason are right here, he muttered. But it was too late. The mask had slipped completely now. I felt something strange in that moment. Not heartbreak anymore. Freedom. Because once someone finally reveals exactly how they see you, you stop exhausting yourself trying to earn their kindness. I carefully closed Harold's notebook and stood from the table. I won't be touring any more facilities, I said calmly. Ava crossed her arms tightly. You're making a mistake. No, I answered softly. I made the mistake 3 years ago when I confused control with love. Daniel looked shattered now. Mom, please. But I was finally done listening to half-truths. Before leaving, I looked once more at the family sitting around that breakfast table. My son, my grandchildren, the woman who spent years slowly reducing me into someone easier to manage. Then my eyes settled on Sophie. She looked relieved. Children recognize truth instinctively once adults stop hiding it. I leaned down and kissed the top of her head gently. Then I walked away from the table without another word. And behind me, for the first time since arriving in Florida, nobody tried to stop me. I checked out of the resort the next morning before sunrise. Quietly. No dramatic goodbye. No confrontation in the lobby. Just me, my suitcase, and the sound of rolling wheels across polished marble floors while exhausted tourists still slept upstairs. The young clerk, Emily, stood behind the front desk when I approached. Her expression softened immediately when she saw me alone. Leaving early? She asked gently. Yes. She glanced toward the elevators instinctively. Will your family be coming down? I looked toward the dark hallway for a brief moment. Then I smiled faintly. I think everyone finally said everything they needed to say. Emily nodded like she understood more than she admitted. People who work around families long enough usually do. She handed me the printed receipt quietly. Then, after a small hesitation, she reached across the counter and squeezed my hand softly. I hope wherever you go next, she said, they treat you the way you deserve. That nearly broke me more than the betrayal itself, because kindness feels overwhelming after too much humiliation. Outside, Dawn stretched pale pink across the Florida sky, while warm ocean air drifted through the palm trees. The resort looked peaceful from a distance. Beautiful. Funny how appearances work. I climbed into the airport shuttle alone and watched the coastline disappear slowly through the window. Not once did my phone ring. Not from Daniel. Not from Ava. Not even a text. And somehow, that silence hurt less than I expected. Because once illusions die, reality becomes easier to carry. Halfway to the airport, my phone finally buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Mom, please don't leave like this. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked the phone without answering. For years, I confused delayed guilt with love. They are not the same thing. Back in Ohio, rain greeted me when the plane landed. Cold gray rain. Home weather. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, the sky had already darkened. And there it was. My house. The white porch swing Harold built 20 years ago still creaked gently in the wind. The roses along the fence needed trimming. One gutter sagged slightly above the garage. Perfect. Beautiful. Mine. I stood inside the front hallway for several quiet minutes after entering. The house smelled exactly the same. Coffee. Old books. Lavender hand soap. Memories. Not investments. Not assets. Memories. I walked slowly from room to room, touching familiar things, as if reassuring myself they were still real. Harold's reading chair beside the fireplace. The kitchen table where Daniel used to do homework. The hallway pencil marks measuring Sophie's height every Christmas. People who call these things property have never loved deeply enough to understand them. That night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. Not because life was fixed, because truth no longer hid inside it. The following Monday, I met privately with Martin at his office downtown. Rain tapped softly against the windows while he spread documents carefully across the conference table between us. Trust records, meeting notes, copies of requests Daniel submitted over the past 2 years. Some were harmless, others were not. Repeated questions about trustee activation conditions, discussions about property transfers, assisted care clauses. I listened quietly while turning pages slowly beneath the yellow office light. At one point, Martin removed his glasses and sighed heavily. Harold suspected pressure might eventually happen, he admitted. But I don't think he imagined it would become this coordinated. Coordinated. Such a painful word for family betrayal. Still, despite everything, I surprised myself with my next question. Will Daniel lose everything? Martin studied me carefully before answering. No. Not unless you choose to pursue legal action aggressively. I nodded slowly. Because despite the humiliation, despite the manipulation, Daniel was still my son, and mothers carry impossible grief differently than other people. Martin slid one final document toward me, an amendment request. With this, he explained carefully, you can permanently remove Daniel and Ava from future trustee authority if you wish. I stared at the paper silently. Then I thought about Sophie, about Mason, about the cycle children inherit when adults choose bitterness over wisdom. Slowly, I picked up the pen. But instead of removing Daniel completely, I changed the structure. New independent oversight. Restricted financial access. Mandatory third-party review. No single family member would ever quietly control my future again. Not ever. When I finished signing, Martin looked relieved. You know, he said softly, Harold would be proud of you. That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Because, for 3 years after losing my husband, I thought surviving meant becoming smaller, quieter, less demanding, less visible. I was wrong. Surviving meant remembering who I was before grief convinced me I needed permission to matter. 2 weeks later, Daniel came to the house alone. No Ava, no children, just my son standing nervously on the same front porch where Harold once taught him how to ride a bicycle. He looked exhausted, older than 44 somehow. I opened the door calmly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then finally, very quietly, he said, I'm sorry. Real apologies sound different than excuses. Shorter, heavier. I stepped aside and let him enter. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee while rain slid softly down the windows outside. Daniel cried once. Only briefly, but enough. He admitted Ava pushed constantly about finances after Harold died. About security. About opportunities. About how inefficient the trust was structured. And little by little, avoiding conflict became easier than defending boundaries. I didn't realize how far things had gone, he whispered. I believe part of that. Not all of it, but part. And at my age, partial truth matters more than perfect apologies. Before leaving, Daniel stood awkwardly near the front door. Will you ever forgive me? I looked at my son carefully. The little boy who once feared thunderstorms. The man who let silence replace courage. Then I answered honestly. I love you, I said softly. But love and trust are not the same thing. Tears filled his eyes immediately. He nodded once. And this time, when he walked away, he looked back before reaching the driveway, just like he used to as a child. Months passed after that. Slowly, life became quieter again, but not lonely. There's a difference. I joined a gardening club downtown, started volunteering twice a week at the library, took a train trip through Vermont during autumn just because Harold and I once talked about doing it someday. And every morning, I still drank coffee on my own porch beside Harold's roses. Only now, when I looked at the house around me, I no longer saw a widow waiting to be managed. I saw a woman who survived being underestimated. Funny thing about families. Sometimes the people who call you weak are only revealing how badly they hoped you'd stay that way. And every now and then, usually at sunset when the porch light glows softly against the windows, I think back to that resort lobby in Florida. To Ava whispering, "She's just the old woman." I smile every time now, because she was wrong. I was never just the old woman. I was the woman who built the life they nearly destroyed.